welcome to this week's episode of the Uncovery podcast. My name is Maddie and I'm in recovery from anorexia, and I talk about it on this podcast and have guests sometimes to talk about topics like recovery, mental health, diet culture, and all kinds of stuff. So this week I went to the doctor and it was in person, and you might be asking, well, Maddie, you always go to the doctor in person. Why would you ever have a phone call appointment with your doctor? And I would say, very good question. During COVID in the eating disorder program, I guess they started doing phone call doctor visits, and it seems like an essential in-person service to me to go to the doctor. But I suppose if there's nothing particularly physically challenging or urgent going on, then perhaps a phone call check-in is sufficient given the circumstances. But I had a doctor visit in person for the first time in a while. And the first thing that I want to say about that is hospital gowns. Why? I understand why they have to exist. And I also actually understand why in the eating disorder program, they would probably have us wear them for our checkups. It's an access thing, but it's also, they probably don't want you, hiding stuff in your pockets to make yourself weigh more, to people do that kind of stuff. Wear a whole bunch of bulky clothing to make it seem like you're gaining weight if you're not when you're in recovery. Like people do crazy stuff like that. I think people they put tie little weights in their hair, and it's insane the things that people will do when they have eating disorders and aren't really ready to recover. But hospital gowns do not need to be designed the way that they are. You could, I'm sure, maybe they have better ones now, or please tell me that somebody has done either a zip up or a button or a Velcro or something, but do your arms going forward? Do your arms going backward? There's no ties where the ties are supposed to be. It's not really like a bathrobe. It's there's one on the inside that has to cross over to the outside, then there's one on the back. I've put them on before, and it felt like I had been successful in the past. And then I was trying to put this thing on. I was trying to change quickly because I just want to get in and do the thing and get out. But I'm in there for 5 minutes trying not to be an idiot, trying to figure out how to put this damn gown on. And there's strings, and I'm not sure where to tie them because I don't want to be naked. And it's anyway, eventually I sort of figured out some way to tie it where I was good enough. But anyway, if that hasn't been designed, an actual easy to get into and out of hospital gown that is still fit for its purpose, if that hasn't been done, somebody go invent that, because you would make $1 million. Okay, so that was the first thing. But the other thing that I was thinking about in regards to the doctor visit is that this was the first time that I had gone to the doctor and been I know I've gained weight and it's a good thing and I'm not stressed about it, and it's not going to change the way that I eat in the days leading up to it. It's not going to change how much water I drink that morning. I'm not going to try to make myself as, small or as light as possible so that there's some kind of communication that I'm still not well. 'Cause that's something that I used to do. It was I would want to be the lightest for the weigh-ins. And even though the whole idea of it is to see your actual progress and things like that. But anyway, I didn't do any of those things. And it didn't even occur to me to behave that way. I ate before at the times that I was going to eat anyway. I ate the things I was going to eat anyway. Nothing about my behavior changed as a result of, having anxiety about going to the doctor. I was just okay, go do it next. So that felt monumental, actually, because I've been going in and out of doctors' offices and getting weighed for quite some time now. And so this was a little bit of a moment. Okay, today I'm excited about the topic because I do love an opportunity to sort of put on my little behavioral scientist, researcher hat and talk about things that are nerdy, but also about eating disorders. Because there's a lot of research that can tell us things about eating disorder recovery and what it's like to have an eating disorder, and the whys and the hows about how it all comes together. And it has been actually particularly helpful to me in certain moments to actually understand the research and the science behind eating disorders and behind eating disorder recovery, because to me, it makes it more real and practical in some way. So, when you're meeting with your dietitian, you're like, well, what's in a carbohydrate? And there's like some level of knowledge that actually seems to sort of help and say, okay, that makes sense. That's actually what science says. Now I believe you a little bit more, instead of just taking people's word for it. But okay, so we're going to talk about this study. And so because at the end of the Second World War, there was a huge danger of a bunch of people basically being in famine because of the conflict. They wanted to take a study and understand what are the effects of semi-starvation and what are the impacts of then these different ways of rehabilitating semi-starvation after, so that they could do things post-war that would be effective. So they recruited a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of men. Apparently over 400 men volunteered to participate in this study as an alternative to military service. And so then they, examined like 100 of them, put them through all of these, physical and psychological tests, because they got to make sure that these people are in good mental health, good physical health, able to get along reasonably well with other people that are also enduring starvation. And they needed to be sort of, committed to the cause. So at the end of it, they only had 36 participants in this study. And here's what they did. It went over a year, and it's called the Minnesota, Starvation Experiment, because it was done at the University of Minnesota. But they did this throughout a year, and they were assigned specific work tasks. So they were expected to walk a certain amount of miles every week. They were keeping a personal diary, and then they were basically, watched and studied and measured in every single way all the way along. So, physically, metabolically, mentally, emotionally, it was very, very intensive. So they've committed this year, and it was broken down into 4 parts. The first period was a control period. And I'm nerding out about this because you always want to understand your baseline. What is happening before you do anything to these people? So it's this standardization, and they had a controlled diet for 12 weeks, and it was about 3,200 calories of food. And throughout this sort of first 12 weeks, they continued to run this like battery of tests and just control for, where were people to start off with in all of these different areas. So that goes on for 12 weeks. And then for 24 weeks, they have a semi-starvation period, and they just cut these guys' foods. So this is 6 months basically. And immediately they cut it in half to like 1,560 calories per day. Meals were, sort of trying to mock what would generally have been available and eaten. So like root vegetables and bread and macaroni. And so they did this for 6 months. They starved these men basically. And just as an aside, like 1,560 calories is more than what like so many shitty diets recommend, right? Like you hear about the number 1,200 calories and blah, blah, blah. Like the starvation period was 1,560 calories. So just as a note, they got 2 meals a day. They did the same thing for all of the different men. And the purpose of this starvation period was to bring down their weight by 25%. So what they did is they tracked their weight over time. And if there was a couple of participants, I think, that got kicked out of the study because they didn't lose enough weight or they didn't want to do it anymore or something like that. It's like, yeah, obviously that would suck. But yeah, so it was a 6 months of starvation. And there's this photo, this very well-known, I think, photo that came out afterwards that was taken of these men after, and it is shocking. So after this semi-starvation period, they were indeed starving. The third phase went on for 12 weeks, and they were divided into different groups and had a really, really controlled rehab period for their diet. So it was this, different sort of versions of speed of increase of intake, different types of, vitamins and supplementation, different protein levels to see under rehabilitation conditions of different kinds, how did different people behave, act, or gain weight and things like that. So that went on for 12 weeks, was like the controlled rehabilitation. And then after that, for 8 weeks to the end of the year, it was unrestricted. So they were recorded and monitored still very carefully, but it was like, eat whatever you want, whenever you want, completely. So what happened to these men? First, the physiological effects. It wasn't just about them losing weight. They had huge gastrointestinal issues, dizzy, headaches, really bad insomnia, edema, losing their hair, being intolerant to cold. Stop me if this starts to sound familiar, right? We're talking about eating disorders on this podcast. Their BMR, so this sort of basal metabolic rate, which is that, base rate of how, quickly you process energy in your body, that came down. And they were losing muscle mass, a ton of muscle mass, which makes sense because your body starts to eat away at itself. So their muscle mass decreased by 40%. And obviously all of those physical effects are incredibly, incredibly damaging and to be expected when you do not nourish the body. What they found really surprising at the time was what happened mentally and cognitively for these men. So they got really preoccupied with food, both during the starvation period and during the rehabilitation phase. So when they were eating more, they were still obsessed with food. So they were only talking about food. They were only reading about food. They would get recipe books. 3 of them went on to become chefs. So out of 36, that seems like a disproportionately large amount of chefs within that sample group. They couldn't concentrate, and what was a bit strange was they started to become really possessive around their food when they were having meals. So they were worried that other people would try to eat their food. They were like guarding it, eating it down to the last crumb, kind of that licking the plate clean. Because, that scarcity mindset, when you don't have enough, you're like, I will take every single thing that I can. This was interesting. And also, when we think about why we're talking about this, they started chewing gum, like a lot of gum. They ended up having to put a cap on the amount of gum that they were allowing them to chew because they were actually chewing so much that their mouths were becoming damaged. And if some of the symptomology of eating disorders, a lot of gum chewing happening because it's this like, I need to chew on something. I need to feel like I'm eating. And so I'll just chew gum to keep myself, quote unquote, satiated. Now, it got weirder even when they started rehabbing the food. So they would binge, a lot of them. They would eat a lot, obviously, after the starvation period, during the refeed period. But this even continued on after like the study and after refeeding, after they were sort of quote unquote, out of the study and refed and back to their weights. They continued to have these behaviors, these weird food behaviors that had started in starvation. Some of them developed body image concerns that they never had before. So we're starting to piece together, like, it is indeed a physical impact, but the physical impact of restriction causes some of these behavioral and cognitive and mental struggles that come later. So this might go without saying, but there were a lot of emotional changes as well. So much higher levels of anxiety and depression during both the semi-starvation period and the rehab phase. What I thought was interesting is that the reported levels of depression were actually higher in the rehabilitation phase. So as they're scaling up this food, more levels of depression than even when they were being starved. But then I kind of got to thinking, we feel quite numb when we're restricting. We feel quite numb when we're underweight and when we're starving. And then as you sort of start to reintroduce food and eat more, things start to come back online. You start to feel more just in general. And so, obviously good and bad feelings come back more over time. So that I thought was really interesting. The only thing that seemed to, perk them up or have any kind of emotional reaction at all was when they were talking about food or weight or hunger. And so maybe the most, shocking part of it is how the behaviors lingered afterwards. When they were able to eat freely and quote unquote normally, they had more conflict with each other. They were stealing food. They were binging on food. And these lasting effects went on past the study. So a lot of them sort of developed what we would call today binge eating disorder, or ate until they were, much higher weight than they were to begin with when they were sort of quote unquote normal and fine. And so there's long-term effects that these volunteers were experiencing. And that gives us, I think, a little bit of insight into, the long-term effects of having an eating disorder. Keep in mind that this was done over a 1-year period, and many people have eating disorders for years and years and years that they're in this sort of state. So obviously this study could never be reproduced. This would be incredibly unethical, but this study is still one of the most important studies that we have in terms of understanding eating disorders and their treatment. And I think that there's a few really key takeaways from it. First, the, cognitive impact of malnourishment, especially if you're thinking about younger people where their brains are still developing, can be huge. And those long-term effects can be really, really detrimental. So I think it's important to think about things like early intervention and, recognizing early when something's going on with somebody that you love or see or spend time with that seems to be struggling. Also, that if you have a predisposition to developing an eating disorder, low nourishment could trigger it and tip it over the edge. So even if you were quote unquote fine to begin with, and then for whatever reason, go on a diet or whatever it is, that sort of tips the scales, as it were, in terms of triggering that eating disorder onset and then having those psychological impacts happen after. I think it helps maybe loved ones to understand that it isn't a choice to have an eating disorder, that it isn't something that can be this, this vain, readily controlled thing, that there are very real effects that happen when you restrict someone's food and then it sort of is out of their hands. It really latches on and takes control. And so as much as, we know about the emotional underpinnings of mental illness and how important that is, eating disorders and anxieties and why we use this for a coping mechanism, I think this actually really hits home that the physiological impacts of starvation also have this reciprocal effect on the brain and behaviors of those who have eating disorders. So there's this whole camp of sort of, recovery advocates that talk about nutritional rehabilitation as almost the only thing that matters. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I see it as kind of this parallel lockstep between handling the emotional and the physical as well. But it does really give a lot of insight into, prioritizing nutritional rehabilitation and prioritizing the food. It's not about the food, but it kind of is. So an interesting study. I enjoy nerding out about this stuff. Now, I will say that I did not read, I think it's like, a 50 chapter, 2-part book that actually ended up being the result of this study. So I did not read that entire thing, but I hope that this gave you the gist of it anyway. And yeah, that's all that I had for this episode. I would love if you would hop over to Apple or Spotify and give us a rating and a review. And yeah, we will catch you on the next episode of the Uncovery podcast.